There is not a square inch in the whole domain of our human existence over which Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not cry, mine.
Hello, friends, and welcome back to this edition of Nuance. I'm Case Thorpe, and glad to have you with us. Just to remind you, please like and subscribe. It really helps us to get word out there. Well, today, our special guest is Michael Graham. Michael, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Case. It's good to be here.
I want to explain to everybody listening, it's a bit of a new day for the collaborative as we have expanded our focus to the public square. Certainly, faith and work, a key component in that. But thinking about how do we prep and equip professionals, Christian professionals, for their life, work, and ministry in the public square. And so we've even nuance this podcast. So there are bi-weekly guests on a variety of topics that apply. And we're throwing in an extra weekly spiritual formation episode, just 10 minutes long, called Formed for Faithfulness. And it's a bit of a devotion and reflection on the public square, and it tracks with the Christian liturgical year. So please be sure and check that out. Well, Michael is a friend and a colleague here in Orlando. I've loved getting to know him over the years. I first got to know him when he was a pastor at Orlando Grace Church. And now he is the program director for the Keller Center for Cultural Apologetics at the Gospel Coalition. He is a graduate of University of Florida. Go Gators. You know, Michael, my son is awaiting his admissions letter any day now to UF. So we are on the edge of our seats. The Lord knows. He has a degree from Reformed Theological Seminary, husband of one, father of two. And today he is going to share with us about his new highly acclaimed book, The Great Dechurching. The Great Dechurching. It's got a lot of great coverage. Perhaps you've heard a bit about it. We will have a link to order this in our show notes. And I just want to encourage you, whether you're in pastoral ministry or not, this book has a lot to say about our culture right now. The research is intense. And it's co-written with Jim Davis, a son of First Presbyterian Church of Orlando. I'll have the world know. We want to claim him as one of our own. But Michael and I were together at Tim Keller's funeral in New York, and it was such a special, special time. So, Mike, let me hand it over to you. And I just appreciate your work here. So tell us a little bit about you, and if you could then drift into how this book came to be.
Yeah, Case, thank you. So this book came to be because Jim and I were working on the same pastoral staff at Orlando Grace Church here in Orlando, Florida. And we'd come across some data that said that nearly half of our city had dechurched, and that we had the same percentage of evangelicals as Seattle or New York City.
That blows my mind.
Yeah, we were kind of scratching our head because, Orlando feels a lot different culturally and even religiously than either of those two cities. So we felt like, okay, we need to know more about what's going on here. And it kind of dawned on us, after a little while, just kind of thinking about it and whiteboarding it, that, Seattle and New York City are more unchurched cities, but Orlando is more of a dechurched city. And so, people here have more context for, having grown up in many ways in the church, but not being in the church here today. And so, we tried to figure out, okay, we wanted to get our hands on, any and all data that we could. And there wasn't much there, particularly information that was either granular or recent. And because we needed actionable information, if half of your city has this, belongs to this particular demographic, and we don't know much about this particular demographic, well, we felt like we can't do our responsibility as pastors here in the city of Orlando. And, if we don't have information about, well, who are these people and why did they go? And can we do anything about it?
But at this point, you had not done your own research. you were motivated by another study.
Yeah. So yeah, we looked at some stuff from Barna, and then I talked with Justin Holcomb, and him and Glenn Lucky had done
Uh,
some research back in 2014.
we love
But
Bishop Holcomb.
yes, but it's like, data is all about recency, and it's all about granularity in order to be able to have information that's, pastorally and philosophy of ministry wise
Mm,
being actionable. And
mm.
so like that level of granularity nor the recency, neither of those things were there. So we needed to go and commission something that was new, and we wanted to do it right as COVID was, kind of after COVID was over for
Mm.
not just red states but blue states. So
So then you reach out to Ryan Burge now to do the research. He is a sociologist. Why Ryan? And I imagine it was a pretty expensive effort. How'd you pay for it?
yeah, so we raised the funds. I had some good friends uh, in a church in Missouri who were very helpful for us. That we wouldn't have been able to do this were it not for their assistance and fundraising. And then Ryan, if you know Ryan at all, he's the best religion data person in the country, and he has a unique vantage point because he's an ordained minister. In the ABC USA, the American Baptist Church,
Mm.
which is a mainline Baptist denomination, and so he actively pastors on a week in week out basis, and then but his primary work is his work as a social scientist at Eastern Illinois University. In addition to that, he's a very prodigious publisher of religious data. I mean, it's crazy. You if you're listening to this, you need to subscribe to his newsletter, which is can be found at graphsaboutreligion.com.
Okay.
So Ryan produces, he produces 2 articles a week, one on Monday, one on Thursday, and they're always must reads. So Ryan, we wanted to work with somebody as a data partner who would have the ability, where we could publish not just in evangelical circles, but we wanted to be able to publish much more broadly than that. We needed to be able to publish in a way that it could be cited by academics, where it could be cited by any of the journalistic outlets on those things. We learned that some of the journalistic outlets won't publish data from a number of data sources that
Mm.
that evangelicals will publish from. Because of research methods and a lack of a university review board process. And so,
Okay.
yeah, so
Now,
that's why
did you go find Ryan because of his reputation, or you already you knew him?
I didn't know Ryan personally before this process. I knew his reputation, had been following it for some time.
Got it.
So yeah, so we reached out to him with the project, and he basically said, yeah, if you can raise the funds, let's do it together. And
Okay.
and then he looped in another really excellent political scientist, Paul Jupe, who helped us with the survey design, because we wanted our study to be able to be parallel and collinear, and to be able to speak to be able to speak intertextually with
Mm,
other
mm.
studies that have existed. And it's a way to also, sometimes you'll ask questions that are identical that are in other
Right.
studies, so that you
Right.
can make sure the integrity of your data set is sound, so that you can compare the outcomes from your study with another study and make sure
Okay.
that they're in the ballpark of each other.
So speaking of outcomes, give us sort of the snapshot of the big findings.
Yeah, so I don't want to bury the lead. The most important thing that we learned was that we're in the largest and fastest religious shift in American history.
Wow.
So we had a hunch that was the case. This is, we're talking 40 million adult Americans who have left houses of worship. And so dechurched, in our definition, is somebody who used to go to church on a monthly or greater basis, and now go to church or a house of worship less than once per year. So essentially not at all. So that means if, we didn't count you as dechurched if you just went on Christmas last year or just Easter,
Ah.
last year. there's several million other people that, are just Christmas and Easter only people.
Creasters. We call them creasters. We love our creasters, but we'd love to see them more often.
We call them CEOs, Christmas and Easter only.
I like it.
But yeah, no. So the previous fastest shift before was the 25 years after the Civil War, basically from 1870 up through 1895. And then the number of people who have left is larger than the First Great Awakening, Second Great Awakening, and all of the Billy Graham Crusades combined. So
Now, is that adjusted for population?
yeah, adjusted for population. It's the fastest
Wow.
shift. Yeah.
Wow. Okay, let's dwell on that for a bit because that really moved me. So even though we're probably 300 million right now in America ish.
Yeah, it's about 350 million adults.
Okay, 350. Even though in those days they were radically less, the percentage boost from the First Great Awakening, so mid 1700s, the percentage boost, and by boost I mean people finding faith and going to their local church, and the Second Great Awakening, which is early 1800s, and then you say there was this huge boost after the Civil War.
Yes.
And then the Billy Graham Crusades of the 20th century. So we have lost percentage-wise more here recently than those gains in those eras.
Yes.
Wow. Wow. That's just a lot to process and think in, to take in. Okay, go ahead. Sorry. Finish your big finding.
Yeah, so that shift is 25% faster than any of those other periods that you mentioned. So obviously those things are, that's disconcerting. It's troubling. However, we were kind of surprised at the highest altitude. I think there were two storylines that people had to kind of explain the shift, because I think people have felt that shift. And if your media diet leaned maybe a little bit to the left, then the story that was there was, well, lots of people have left houses of worship because of racism, misogyny, political syncretism, clergy scandal, or clergy abuse. And then if your media diet leaned a little bit to the right, then the storyline there had been, well, people have left houses of worship because of secular progressivism or because of, say, the sexual revolution. And can you find a few million people who fit either of those storylines? Yes, you can. So neither of those storylines are false storylines. Okay, but what we learned was that the largest thing was actually a much more boring story than the story coming out of either of those, the left leaning or the right leaning story, and that was most people left houses of worship for really boring things. So, for example, the top three reasons why people dechurched was: number one, I moved; number two, attendance was inconvenient; or number three, some kind of family change, divorce, remarriage, the birth of a child, those different kinds of things. And after that, you start to see some things that are, maybe more fit some of those other storylines. But really, it's just been the habits and rhythms of American culture, society, and these kinds of things, really pedestrian things that seem, maybe the best word to put around it is pragmatic. And so the good news with that is...
If I may,
go ahead.
I want to sit on that just because as an evangelical and our particular church moved from a more mainline progressive denomination to a more conservative evangelical one, which a lot of other churches are in the process of doing or have done. And, our convictions were it was the more progressive agendas in the denominational hierarchy that led to the precipitous decline in church participation. And yet you're saying, actually, no. Is that what I hear you saying?
What I'm saying is that it's complicated. The mainline decline, it is complex. You've seen decline among the mainline, more decline among progressive mainline than some of the more conservative, parts of the mainline. However, there's been pretty precipitous decline for both of those things. There's complexity to that. Some of that has to do with just the, where mainline churches are, and you have a lot of decline both in the Midwest and the Northeast from a dechurching standpoint. And so, that's some of that's in the mix. The movement in, Christianity, particularly among evangelicals, is away from denominations and towards non-denominational
Mm-hmm.
and or networks instead of denominations. So there's some complexity to some of those things.
Okay. So we're not saying those progressive theologies and practices were not a factor, but the top three factors were more pragmatic in nature.
Yes. Yeah, but those things are definitely, I mean, it's not that those two stories were false stories. You can find plenty of evidence of both of those stories there in the data. It's just, in the book, we talk about how there's, at the highest altitude, there's two different kinds of dechurching. There are people who left casually, and that's, these pragmatic people, or it's just kind of habits and rhythms. And it kind of seems like they left church unintentionally.
Mm-hmm.
And that's about 30 of the 40 million people.
Mm.
And then about 10 million people definitely left church highly intentionally. And we called those people dechurched casualties. So casually dechurched casualties. And the casualties, they left intentionally because there was some kind of, at least one or more many problems that they were experiencing in church. And so some of those things happened at the individual level, and other of those things happened at the institutional level. And for some people, it was happening both on the individual and institutional levels.
Okay, so that is interesting. The dechurched casually, is that right? Casually.
Mm-hmm. Casually dechurched and dechurched casualties.
The casually dechurched, it was kind of unintentional. They didn't just get up and storm out for something. And yet neither, though, does it say to me that their discipleship was deep enough that their faith sincerity drove them to reconnect or stay connected. And that's where later I want to get in the conversation, like, to what degree do we as pastors are complicit in this, or as church leaders, that our discipleship was kind of shallow and needs to be deeper?
Yeah, that's the embarrassing thing. I've been clergy most of my adult life, so it wasn't. Initially, I was like, oh, well, all these people left casually. Well, that's kind of good news. And most of the people who left, particularly among the casualty church, most of them are willing to return right now. So that's good news. A lot of good news in the middle of the bad news. However, yeah, it's definitely embarrassing when you kind of drill down and you're like, oof, man, this faith is really shallow. Of the 15 million of the 40 million people who left out of evangelical contexts. And when you look at the kind of the orthodoxy scores in the book, and orthodoxy score for us is basically just like Nicene Creed level Christianity. So things like the Trinity, humanity of Jesus, divinity of Jesus, sinlessness of Jesus, the atonement, and the resurrection of Jesus, and the reliability of the Bible. Those 7 things looked really bad among about 10 of the 15 million people who left evangelical churches. Wow. It looks like about 5 million of them have at least an accurate understanding of the gospel, but the other 10 are in a pretty rough shape. Of the 15 million people who left, we devote a chapter we developed 4 profiles from the data. In the first of those profiles, we called cultural Christians. This is 8 million of the 15 million people who left evangelical churches. And only 1% of cultural Christians said that Jesus is the Son of God.
Wow.
And so, it's kind of difficult to call those people like, regenerate in the faith, like walking with Jesus when, have such a low view of him and his personhood.
Well, and as I've read the book and heard even more of the interviews you and Jim have done, it's dawned on me you needed, from a sociological research basis, to get more to general practice rather than, I don't sense that your data gets too much into the specifics of poor discipleship, those sorts of things. Would you concur?
Yeah, I mean, we flew the plane pretty high in terms of overarching insights. There's definitely some insights there into the kinds of weaknesses of spiritual formation, and particularly also just the ways institutional churches relate to their contexts and relate to the people in their city. There's some things there. We built another resource on this website, dechurching.com. We built a 20-point audit for churches. So that's there.
Great.
That's for free. So, if you're listening to this and you're clergy or you're a church leader, there's a 20-point audit of, basically 20 areas that definitely impact dechurching. And
audit of you as an individual or your church?
No, audit for the institutional church. So, it's basically, hey, how is our church doing on these 20 areas that all impact dechurching? For example, one of those things would be like, oh, do we have a process for when people move out of our city? Do we help them find a good church in a new city? Or do we have a process for when people are moving into our city to help them get connected to our local church? So, in 19 other things, kind of like that definitely impact dechurching, all with an empirical basis. So that audit is there for free on dechurching.com. There's also some worksheets that you can pay for if you're like, oh, well, how do we get better on, we decided we failed on 5 of these 20. So how do we do better? There's a paid resource there, but the most of value there is in that audit.
Okay. So as a pastor, I get a little picky when people talk about, oh, I'm going to church. I'm like, no, you really mean you're going to worship? Because, is the church is the building, the church is the living fellowship of the people, but y'all use the word church. And when you say going to church, I believe you're assuming by that Sunday morning worship or a worship service, whatever time. It's not calculating for Bible study, small group, maybe a service project, or if your kid plays on the church baseball team.
Right. Yeah, we have mainly in mind just kind of corporate worship. But when we were studying this, we studied all religious traditions because you have to in order to be able to publish, academically for these things. It's just that, well over 90% of people who attend or used to attend it's all, out of one of the Christian traditions.
Okay. Well, if I can, thank you for this overview. And listeners, I had asked Michael, I wanted to kind of go in a little bit different direction than his and Jim's interviews have been in other formats. And my goodness, I mean, Michael, y'all have gotten such great hits. Like you've the book's been mentioned in the New York Times, the Ben Shapiro show, right? I want you to brag a little bit. Tell us some other places your book has been featured.
Oh, geez. Okay. Yeah. Those places, the Atlantic, the Washington Post, NPR, C-SPAN, National Review.
That's right. C-SPAN came and did a whole episode with y'all.
Yeah. Dispatch, Christianity Today, TGC.
And now Nuance, right? Like put us up.
Yes, Nuance. And Mere Orthodoxy. Shout out to Jake.
There you go. Shout out to Jake. All right. So in the last, I guess, 5th or maybe chapters of your book, you shift to lessons for the church. And I really appreciate that you didn't just give us data and tell us there's a problem, but it's an attempt to course correct the present church. And it's not just programmatic quick fixes. And why did you approach it that way? I think that's very important because pastors have the tendency to look for the next golden bullet. But rather that you resisted giving them that. Why is that?
Well, I mean, I think, pastoring in any time, but especially in our own cultural moment, it has a lot of complexity to it. So I'd rather speak principially than, because I don't think there's not silver bullets for these things. I mean, on the one level. I
said golden bullet. You're right. Silver bullet.
Because look, we can make a difference in terms of how we relate to people personally, okay, as individuals. And we can also we can grow as and building healthier institutions. And so we need to do both of those things kind of at the same time. And so we wanted to talk about, okay, what can we do as individuals to relate better as we're interacting with, the people that God is regularly putting in our lives. And then we need to grow in our ability of what does it look like for our local church to be engaging with our community as well. So how do we do both of those things at the same time? Well, on the individual front, there's a lot of work that looks like it needs to be there on the way that we relate interpersonally. So we unpack in chapter 9, we talk about 6 keys to relational wisdom. So in that chapter, we talk about God awareness, self-awareness, others awareness, awareness of how other people are experiencing you, and then cultural awareness and emotional awareness. And
you're not just talking about pastors with these things. You're talking about all Christians. You would suggest move in this relational wisdom direction.
Yes, all of us. Yeah, because, so many of the things of when we were looking, particularly at the dechurched casualties, so many of these things boil down to just the way that either people related to them or the way that the church related to them. And so, well, that's good news, because if people are experiencing pain because of how we related to them or how the church related to them, well, those are things that are in my control. I can't control secular progressivism. I can't control the sexual revolution. I can't create, institutional reforms across, Roman Catholic, mainline, and evangelical churches. But what we can do is I can inspire other people to relate with increasing wisdom with the people who God's put in their life. And we can inspire local churches to promote a gospel that's true, good, and beautiful all at the same time. So those are things that are within our control. And actually, I mean, that's been like the greatest news about, everything, in the middle of all this bad news is there's a lot of things that are in our control that are low hanging fruit that we can do better on. And actually the things that are most central and that are animating the most people's concerns really just have to do with things that are more in our control than those much larger things that are well outside of our control.
Well, I hear you. It does sound like good news, because it's not like your findings showed that people are rejecting the Christian worldview, right? It's not that people have investigated the worldview options and found Christianity wanting. Rather, it's the nature of the church and its people today that they're walking away from. Would you concur?
Yeah, it's more that, obviously, are you going to have people who have intellectual objections to the faith? Sure. But by and large, it looks like things that are just a lot more pragmatic than that. And it looks like things that, if we as Christians tell a better story and tell a story that's faithful to the text, most importantly, namely that we have a gospel that is actually true. Jesus did, live a perfect life. He died a substitutionary death for his people and raised himself from the dead. But it's also, the Jesus path is also good and beautiful. We believe, and I think, genuinely, rightly, and supported by, not just our sacred text, but supported by real life, that when we seek to walk the path of discipleship that Jesus has put before us, it's a path that leads to human flourishing. That doesn't mean, human flourishing doesn't mean just like health and wealth. But what it does mean is we become more whole people, and we become healthier people in our whole person as we seek to put off ourselves and put on Christ. And when we seek to also walk in, the 59 one another's, and we seek to walk with the fruit of the Spirit and not in the flesh, we become more healthy and whole people. It is a path that leads to human flourishing, even though there is sacrifice to those things and there is suffering in that. This is a treasure in the field. There is a cost to discipleship, but when we understand that what God has put before us is worth putting every other thing that might have, the love of our heart. And
Preach.
this is the number one love. Well, when we rightly order that love with all of these other loves, yeah, it is a path that leads to, to us being,
Mm.
being more whole human beings. So I think when that's the story that not just we tell, but it's a story that we live individually, and it's a story that we live as communities, as local churches, then I think that that's something that's really going to be compelling.
Dude, I
And
love it. I mean, you've shifted from author, researcher to preacher. Your pastor's heart is clear. And it just, I mean, it makes me feel a little guilty, but like we in the church have just done a poor job of forming our people. I just can't help but carry or feel some of the blame and know that we've got to disciple differently. And that's a big passion of mine. I'm working on a book on discipleship for the 21st century, and it's got to be different than it was for me in my suburban Atlanta mainline experience. I'm grateful, so grateful for those men and women that loved me. And my parents did the best they knew, but it worked for me, but not for most of my peers. So I don't know how to, I just feel a lot of burden.
I think one of the reasons why, Case, both you and I are fond of Tim Keller, and, why we, took the time um, to go and experience his memorial service in New York City, was because Tim was good at bringing multiple different traditions together. He
Mm,
had this, kind of confessional reformed strain, this missional strain, and this pietistic strain that he kind of brought all together, in one person. And that, the mixture and the cross pollination of the best parts of each of those things. So the best parts of thinking, the best parts of feeling, and the best parts of doing, when you kind of put those things together, you end up with I think, a more coherent faith, in one that, okay, all right, well, my individual Christian life does matter, that pietistic, you know, uh, perspective. And then, okay, the life of the mind, and, having accurate thinking, in general or special revelation. Well, that's important, the
mm,
confessional reform strain. And then the missional innovation piece of, okay, what does it look like to appropriately contextualize, the gospel to whatever my community is. And when we put those three things together, I think we end up, from an institutional standpoint, being able to put a compelling vision of the truth of the gospel, the goodness of the gospel, and the beauty of the gospel all at the same time. So
mm,
I think
mm,
when we're able to do that, I think that will be, when we do that in our churches, we will be able to help close the back door, in ways that where it's probably been a bit more wide open, over the last few decades.
mm. So true. So true. Now, for our listeners, I hope that you get a sense of wherever you may be in your work life, in your neighborhood relations, that there are a number of dechurched folks around you, and engaging them with a sincere and a deep faith and a genuine authenticity is a good, helpful thing. I'm leading up to Michael. Share the surprising and very low bar answer y'all found to one of the ways to help the casually dechurched reengage.
Yeah, so over half the people who left evangelical churches are willing to return today, and it's the overwhelming majority of those who are casually dechurched. So in the book, we kind of outline that there's three different levels of engagement for some people, and so for many people, that there's the first category of just needing a nudge. So the
Needing
sec
a nudge.
yeah, so the second profile in the book, the mainstream dechurched evangelicals. These people left very recently, really just around the time of COVID, and 100% of them are willing to return to an evangelical church. They look Orthodox. You're talking 2.5 million people. They like, hey, as simple as like a water cooler moment or a text message that's something to the effect of like, hey, I'm going to church this Sunday. Like, would you want to come with me and grab lunch after? Or, hey, I'm leading this thing, at church. I'm speaking at this thing, or, I'm doing this Bible study. I'm really excited about it. Like, would you be interested in coming with me? Almost all the people who are in, that category, that they just need that nudge in order to return. And
I want everybody
to
hear this. Like, the nudge is enough. Tell about the church in Missouri that practiced the nudge.
Yeah, so the same church that was helpful for us on fundraising, we gave them a lot of early access to kind of the research findings, and they began incorporating some of that into just two things in their church: the preaching. They started talking about some of dechurching in their preaching, and then they developed some digital strategies to kind of identify some of the people that just kind of needed a little bit of a nudge, and they gave them a digital nudge. They saw a few hundred people.
Digital nudge.
Yeah, they saw a few hundred people, dechurch people begin to come to church. That was above and beyond what they would have otherwise seen normally.
Wow. So they had, just from nudges, invitations, a remarkable response.
Yeah, and it just makes sense. I mean, it's like, okay, in our very digital age, apart from weddings, funerals, and things that are of a sales nature, when is and birthdays, when was the last time that somebody gave you a personal invitation to something?
Right.
Don't you?
Right.
I mean, and how did it make you feel? I mean, doesn't it make you feel like loved and wanted and seen when you get to, somebody says, hey, I want your presence. Like, I want more of you. So I think, one of the things that I want to, that Jim and I want to inspire people to is that for most people, not all, but most, taking some relational risk and giving a nudge or having somebody, to your dinner table and, having some nature of, spiritual or religious conversations or an invitation to church. These are not relationship ending conversations.
And yet we feel like they could be, because, it's one thing to invite somebody to go see a theatrical show, but we get a little weird when it comes to, hey, come to my church, because I think the culture tells us people here, hey, come let me indoctrinate you.
Yeah. And I think, I think some of this, particularly, we're both in our 40s. And I think growing up with that era in America, we were always told that religion and politics were taboo. But it's like, you go online and what do people want to talk about? It's like,
that's my favorite topics.
I mean, people are talking about those things. So it's actually not taboo. Yeah. And I think that there's really, I'll give you I'm a collector of good questions. Ooh. And I think questions are things that help unlock people's hearts, and they're things that unlock people's loves. And so when I think about, as you're relating to people, I think about this acronym FORD: family, occupation, relationships, and dreams. Family, occupation, relationships, and dreams.
So this is pure Michael Graham OG, right?
This is just like what I've developed in my head. Okay. So when I'm, when I move, we moved this past year. Okay. So we're in a new neighborhood, and these are the kinds of things I'm talking about. I want to know about people's family first. And tell me about your work. You're spending, 40 plus hours a week, on something like, tell me what you do. Why do you like it? How did you get into that? Tell me the evolution of those things. What's the best part? What's the hardest part? And then you get into relationships and dreams. So I think once you're at least to like the R in terms of, forming new relationships with people. And, this is just, I don't even think about these things consciously in my head. It's just, when I'm forming new relationships, this is just the natural progression of things.
Yeah.
One of the things that I'll ask once I'm, to the place of like, well, like who, what are some of the more important relationships? I'm interested in what are the important relationships to you individually, friends, but I'm also interested in what relationships to institutions do you
Mm,
have?
yeah,
Okay. And
yeah.
so when I'm talking about those things of like, when we're talking about, key relationships, I'm talking about, well, I'm not just talking
Yeah.
about relationships to individuals. I'm talking about relationships to institutions.
Which is what's suffering and waning so much right now in America.
It is. And so here's the question I want to give everybody who's listening to this. This is a question that I think is very unoffensive, and I think it's something that's very open-ended, and even in a highly secular context, this question has never gone sideways for me. You ready for it? Here's the magic
I've
question.
got my pen ready.
Are you a person of faith?
And that has never gone sideways for you.
Never gone sideways for me. Because, if somebody isn't a person of faith, well, a lot of times people will ask questions about, well, their lack of faith with derision
Mm,
or, with some level of disrespect. Um, are you a person of faith allows, it's agnostic to any particular tradition.
mm,
It
mm.
also allows for the people who don't identify as anything, but maybe they're spiritual in nature, spiritual but not religious. It's open ended enough to basically for anybody to share the evolution of their thoughts on big questions. And it's like at the end of the day, that's what I want to know. Like, tell me the arc of your story on how you process life's biggest questions. So that
Sure.
one question of are you a person of faith will often yield for me all sorts of information about, okay, well, what's the best way that I can relate to you? And, is there pain? Is there not? Is your relationship to these things transactional, pragmatic, frustrating, painful? Like those things, a lot of those things, just kind of begin to surface in that. Um, there's another deeper question that's, I don't always ask, but another place when people are going through something that's hard. Um, another question I'll ask people that sometimes helps bridge the gap into deeper things spiritually is, um, are you a person of prayer? You know,
Yeah, that was gonna be my thought. I've never had anybody turn me down for prayer.
yeah. So those things I think are just easy ways to get a foot in the door into conversation that aren't offensive, that are encouraging, and won't get you in too much. It won't really get you in trouble.
Now, would you distinguish that from, "Can I pray for you?"
Well, that's the follow up question, right?
Yeah, got it,
You know,
got it.
if somebody, are you a person of prayer? Well, they might say no, no, but um, well, hey, I am, and would you be willing to let me, pray with you? So I
Mhm,
think those
mhm.
are, even if the answer to the question is no, there's still that opportunity for a follow up
Yeah.
there.
Well, and I've never had anybody tell me no, and because it's so rare, even sadly in the church amongst, active Christians, it leaves a very meaningful impression and helps folks draw close. In closing, I wanna hit one more thing there. So for our listeners, remember these 2 questions. Use these in your family, neighborhood, and workplaces. Are you a person of faith? And are you a person of prayer? Those are great ways to then help reengage the church. I want to close on this point you make, Michael, about the institutional. And here at the Collaborative, we're big believers in institutions because they change culture in profound ways. They are multi generational beyond ourselves. They bring up and inculcate in positive ways, hopefully, the next round of participants, whether they be workers, members, whatever the institution might be, and send them along in life's journey. And because of this anti-institutional sort of feel and reaction right now amongst Americans, and for partly good reasons, because a lot of institutions have failed in big ways. Um, how would you uh, how would you guide someone in their desire for people to know Christ as they manage the personal and the institutional? Meaning, I want my neighbor to know Jesus, and I want him or her to be in a church, to be active, whether it's my church or not. I know the good that greater community can do for them in their walk. Any words, thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, just like in anything, when we exercise relational wisdom, people boil down to really kind of two things: wants and fears.
Mm,
And those wants and fears come out of, how are the loves of their heart ordered, and how have the loves of their heart played themselves out in the experiences of their life. And so when I think about wants and fears, when we have relational wisdom, we know whether somebody can whether they need to come in the front door of the church, or if they need to come in kind of the side door. And so I think that when we exercise relational wisdom, for the people who need a nudge, well, they're coming in the front door. But the people who need our dinner table, well, they're probably coming in the side door of the church. They need to experience, relational intimacy with us at our dinner table. They probably need, maybe to be connected to something like a small group or something like that, where they can, have some more of their questions answered and kind of see, oh, well, maybe this is a little bit different than either what I grew up with, or this thing that maybe was hard or challenging or even painful for me. So I think, when we exercise relational wisdom in how we are interacting with the people that God's consistently putting in front of us, then we will know we'll have a greater sense with that, that sensitivity to the Spirit of,
mhm,
okay, who is this person? What is their story? What
mm,
are their wants and fears right now? And how does the gospel speak to that? And what are the needs that are there? And so when we do those things and really just kind of think through those things, we pray through those things. And, ideally, we're not doing any of these things just like as one-off people. It's
right.
good for people, just like, when we go, when you go look for, to buy a vehicle, you look at multiple different things before you land. In the same way, like, it's good for people to have multiple different vantage points on, on us. Give them multiple vantage points so they can see, kind
Sure.
of what, it's not just, oh, they're coming kicking our tires. Give them a chance to kick the tires of, some people,
Mm.
so.
Well, and I hear too, you know what? It starts with us. Are we walking close to God and hearing his spirit and being authentic and loving? It is out of that that these questions should arise. And it's out of that that the gospel is seen and felt and draws people. Michael, thank you. I really, really appreciate your time. I know you're in a very busy season, but y'all have done a great work in this book. And I want to encourage everyone to go get your copy of The Great Dechurching. We'll have a link for that in our show notes. Michael, thank you so much.
Thank you, Case. It's been a pleasure.
Like to thank you, our listeners, for being with us. Please, again, like and subscribe. Share this with someone that they might be so edified. Visit us at collaborativeorlando.com to get our biweekly blog, see other videos, check out our library of content, and even events that are coming up. We really want to help you as you live your faith in the public square. And of course, we're across all the social media channels. Check out the episode description for helpful links and resources noted in this interview. Formed for Faithfulness, our 10-minute devotional, hits every single week. In the meantime, I'll be back in 2 weeks with a special guest. Would like to thank our sponsor for this episode, the Magruder Foundation. Couldn't do it without your support. Hope to see you next time for our next Nuance conversation as we pursue faithfulness to Christ and the public square. I'm Case Thorpe, and God's blessings on you.